Welcome to this explainer. Okay, today we're doing something really fascinating. We are diving into a meticulously detailed set of handwritten source notes that unpack the economic history of India under British rule. We're going to objectively decode exactly how a massive, complex architecture of extraction was built, how it actually functioned on the ground, and the lasting impact it left behind on the Indian subcontinent. Let's dive right in.
To really wrap our heads around this, the notes point us straight to a groundbreaking book from 1901, Poverty and Un-British Rule in India by Dadabhai Naoroji. Now, Naoroji wasn't just pointing out that India was poor, he was arguing that this poverty was a deliberate, almost mathematical result of very specific economic policies. And honestly, this is the absolute foundation of the central theory we're decoding today.
So here's our roadmap. First, the drain of wealth. Second, commercializing Indian agriculture. Third, the destruction of handicraft industries. Fourth, the 3 stages of colonialism. And fifth, the unintended positive dimensions. All right, let's jump right into section 1, the drain of wealth, or transfer without return.
So what exactly is this drain? Well, our source material has a very precise definition. The drain of wealth refers to the transfer of wealth and commodities from India to England without any substantial return. Zero. And it's vital to note that while Naoroji first presented this idea, other prominent thinkers of the time, like R.C. Dutt and G. Subramaniam Iyer, also heavily championed this theory. It was a heavily researched, unified economic critique.
Digging into the handwritten notes, you can see the sheer variety of forms this economic drain actually took. I mean, it wasn't just people carrying literal bags of gold onto ships. The notes trace these systemic trade practices all the way back to the 1717 Firman and the Battle of Plassey. It included gifts and exchanges where precious stones were drained by Rajas and Nawabs. And crucially, it involved massive infrastructure projects, most notably the railways. Now, this next detail is honestly both genius and completely devastating. The railways served a dual role. Outbound, they transported raw materials from the Indian countryside straight to the ports. Inbound, they brought finished, manufactured products from England right back into the Indian markets. Furthermore, the notes emphasize that investment in these railways was totally exclusive to British investors, who received a guaranteed interest and a huge share in the profits. It was essentially a guaranteed double profit system perfectly engineered for extraction. Moving on to Section 2, commercializing Indian agriculture, cash over food. The data from our sources paints a pretty stark picture of a changing landscape. Between 1800 and 1860, the area under food crops increased by merely 7%. But meanwhile, the area under commercial or cash crops jumped by a staggering 40%. Think about that. The peasantry was fundamentally shifting from growing food for their own local survival to cultivating cotton, jute, indigo, tea, and opium purely for the global market. So what forced this massive agricultural shift? The notes identify a few key drivers. The Industrial Revolution in England created this insatiable hunger for raw cotton. Then, global events like the American Civil War totally disrupted existing supply chains, shifting the focus directly onto India. You add in the specific geographical conditions of the Deccan region, an absolute abundance of cheap labor, and that railway expansion we just talked about, and you've got the perfect recipe for total agricultural commercialization. But we really can't ignore the human cost behind all this data. The notes describe a tragic pipeline of rural indebtedness. First, extremely high land revenue rates were implemented, sometimes exceeding 50%. Because cash crops are super money-intensive to grow, peasants had to rely on private moneylenders, taking thumb impressions on bond papers at completely exorbitant interest rates. Predictably, they fell into a debt trap, forcing them to sell their land. They went from being proud landowners to mere agricultural laborers. The notes call this large-scale depeasantization, which is a devastating process that directly resulted in severe food insufficiency and tragic famines.
Okay, Section 3, Destruction of Handicraft Industries. The second pillar falls.
While agriculture was being warped, the other main pillar of the 19th century Indian economy was also collapsing. By the closing years of the century, Indian handicrafts had essentially lost their relevance, and the systemic factors dismantling them were highly calculated. Raw materials were continuously transferred to England. A free tariff policy was implemented for British goods entering India. And even more devastating, the rupee and pound exchange rate was deliberately manipulated to promote British exports into India while heavily discouraging Indian exports going out. The source notes introduce a really profound academic concept here, the development of underdevelopment.
Handicrafts were the second biggest source of employment in the entire country. Once they were dismantled, there was literally no alternative industrial source of work. So what happened to all those highly skilled artisans? They were forced to migrate back to agriculture. Think about the gravity of that for a second. It flooded an already struggling agricultural sector, effectively crushing the traditional rural economic system.
Now, to keep things objective, we do have to look at the counter-arguments presented in the text. British economist Maurice D. Morris basically argued that Indian deindustrialization is actually a myth. He posited that after 1860, there was large-scale development in secondary and tertiary sectors, framing it as simply a shift in the mode of production rather than a true decline. However, the notes quickly follow up with a critique of this view, pointing out that Maurice D. Morris completely failed to explain the overall decline in India's GDP and its dropping contribution to world trade during this exact same era.
Let's zoom out a bit for Section 4. 3 Stages of Colonialism, the Macro View.
According to R.P. Dutt, in his book India Today, which is cited throughout the notes, colonialism wasn't just a static, one-and-done event. It's fascinating to look at it structurally. It was an evolving, phased process of economic exploitation designed to benefit the mother country. The notes break this down into a really clear chronological timeline. The phase of mercantilism from 1757 to 1812, the phase of free trade from 1813 to 1860, and finally, the phase of finance capitalism from 1860 to 1947. Let's see how this builds stage by stage.
Phase 1 is mercantilism. Socially, the East India Company adopted a strict policy of non-interference. Politically, they relied on indirect subordination, like the subsidiary alliance. Economically, it was all about controlling trade, particularly in Bengal. By controlling land revenue through the permanent settlement, the exploitation of Bengal actually generated the sheer capital required to fund the British Industrial Revolution back home.
Then we dynamically shift into Phase 2, free trade. And wow, everything changes here. Socially, the British moved to direct interference, introducing Christian missionaries and imposing English laws to change India's cultural characteristics. Politically, they aggressively expanded through the doctrine of lapse. Economically, following Adam Smith's projections, the Charter Act of 1813 ended the East India Company's monopoly. This opened India up to a laissez-faire policy, bringing in other English companies and implementing new land settlements that vastly increased peasant exploitation.
Finally, we hit Phase 3, finance capitalism. Socially, the British completely abandoned direct social reform and pursued a policy of social division, actively dividing Hindus and Muslims through a strategy of divide and rule. Politically, they consolidated power by codifying uniform legal systems like the CRPC and IPC, which is super important because those very codes form the basis of the legal system today. Economically, massive investments were made in secondary sectors like industry and railways, but the notes make it explicitly clear this investment wasn't for local benefit. It caused a massive capital flight from India directly to England. And that brings us to our final part, Section 5, unintended positive dimensions.
So, despite this massive wealth drain we've been talking about, the infrastructure that was laid down did actually lead to some largely unintended modernizing effects. We see the rise of modern industries like cotton, jute, sugar, steel, and coal. Concurrently, a modern Indian capitalist class emerged. The notes specify that this new capitalist class would go on to play a highly significant role in the industrialization of India, and notably, they later contributed greatly to the Gandhian movement.
Looking closely at the details in the source notes, we can really see the culmination of these unintended effects. The policies sparked the rise of a distinct middle class and a class of industrial labor. This new middle class essentially created the mass base for nationalism, contributing to a massive intensity of political demand. Meanwhile, the labor class formed trade unions, which played a huge role in shaping industrial policy and actively pushing back against the entire colonial framework.
Which leaves us with this incredibly powerful paradox to consider. How did the very structures meticulously built over decades for economic extraction, the railways, the uniform laws, the industrial shifts, inadvertently lay the exact foundation for the middle class, the labor unions, and the nationalist movement that eventually dismantled the whole colonial enterprise? It's a fascinating paradox and a powerful reminder of how historical systems of extraction continue to shape the modern world we live in today. Thanks for joining me on this explainer, and keep questioning the history behind the structures around you.